Welcome back. If you're seeing this on the tail of my previous episode, you're probably wondering why I felt the need to create a ridiculous quantity of unbreakable swords. The answer is quite simple, straightforward, entirely comprehensible, and possesses no concerning inferential leaps large enough to invoke mandatory reporting requirements for public service employees in the United States. I want a cat. Gregtech New Horizons told me no, and I refuse to take that as an answer. Hold on to your butt cheeks, folks, because this episode is going to get long, and it is going to get complicated. Case in point, this world I'm in is actually a copy of my live instance made right at the end of the previous episode. To reiterate, this is a copy. Nothing I do here matters. Normally, I try and do destructive testing in a world that is visually different to help everyone, myself included, keep the worlds separate in their head. That is not an option here, because the next set of tests require a very specific set of environmental conditions that would be completely impractical to replicate, namely that of my research completions. You see, I'm in something of a pickle. In order to progress my research, I need a book called The Crimson Rites. Normally, this is dropped by Crimson cultists, which spawn around a naturally generated set piece called an Eldritch Obelisk, which, like everything else in this mod pack, is rather difficult to locate when floating in the middle of an empty void. This book and the obelisk are both needed to progress through Thaumcraft. Period. You physically cannot unlock certain technologies without reading the book. Soapbox time. I promise it is all relevant. I've said this before, but Thaumcraft doesn't really progress like the rest of Gregtech does. In traditional Gregtech, you can sometimes beg, borrow, or steal your way into a fancy machine able to process a couple tiers ahead of your current tech level. Case in point, this is exactly what my Mega EBF did. This, I guess you could call it an oversight, isn't really a problem for pack progression because it doesn't help much in the grand scheme of things. If you do make it, it will be unbelievably expensive relative to your current wealth. You will have no way to power it sustainably, assuming you can power it at all, and you will likely have no way of getting the materials that the machine is supposed to be processing in bulk. Even if the first three problems weren't true, you also would have no use for the stuff that you could make with it, because your tech level is too low to need those higher tier materials. Thaumcraft kind of doesn't care. Rather than your tech base broadening as you progress, it mostly deepens and expands upon a small handful of core mechanics, and a lot of those mechanics involve unlocking passive abilities rather than material progress. Gregtech integration may keep you from being able to craft later game items, but you can still do a whole bunch of later game things. For the most part, the New Horizons team left the research progression up to the discretion of the original mod authors, and the mod authors quite rigorously followed the traditional pattern set by the base Thaumcraft mod, so this works out pretty well in a normal playthrough. This is not a normal playthrough. Tier skipping and breaking the progression meta is required for me to get anywhere, so it falls to me to ask this rather unusual question. What happens if all of a sudden you tech skip the research tree? As it turns out, the research dependencies start breaking down. The Thaumcraft base mod progresses in 4 extremely loosely and mostly arbitrary stages, those being pre-infusion, pre-Eldritch Epiphany, post-Eldritch Epiphany, and post-Primordial Pearl. I have infusion, and I have had my Epiphany. Were I playing a normal game, I would be concerned with finding a Book of the Crimson Rites, opening an obelisk, and obtaining my first Primordial Pearl, but the first two are currently impossible. So let's just ignore them. In a lot of expansion mods for Thaumcraft, and actually even within the base mod itself, things unlock once you've obtained a Primordial Pearl, and in doing so, the assumption was made that you have also completed all of the other prerequisites to getting a pearl normally. Which is an odd assumption to make, because you don't actually have to. For whatever reason, the rarest tier of Thaumcraft loot bag has a vanishingly small chance of dropping a Primordial Pearl. And by vanishingly small, I mean less than 1%. This is not something added by New Horizons. This is a base mod Thaumcraft thing and is probably more intended to be an Easter egg for those people who test everything than a viable strategy for game progression. In any sane and normal version of the game, this would be utterly irrelevant, because there's only 3 ways to get the loot bags, and all of them are nearly unautomatable. The first is by looting dungeon chests, or in my case, using a lunium to simulate the looting of dungeon chests. It's not technically impossible to automate right now, but it is logistically intractable. The second is peck trading, and while it is technically possible, it's going to have to be a mighty cold day downstairs before I consider it to be viable. The third is by player killing rare boss mobs with a looting sword. I have got mobs coming out of holes best left unmentioned, a sudden and mysterious excess of unbreakable looting enchanted swords, and dynamism tablets, which spoof a great deal of player interaction requirements just by existing. And by sheer coincidence, I have also literally been building the mob farm for it right in front of you, so I bet you can guess which option I'm going to be going with. And yeah, for all my grandstanding, it really is just a redux of my other bee-powered mob farm setup, but with swords, now. The challenge with this is figuring out the solution in the first place, not implementing it. And honestly, that's going to be a trend for a lot of this episode. There are going to be a lot of solutions that are super simple to implement that require hours of reading code and sifting through stupid half-remembered lore snippets and tearing apart testing worlds to discover what I need to do them properly. Either way, the farm's prepped and ready to fire, so now all I need to do is get my swords in and start the timer ticking. Dynamism tablets are a little spotty when it comes to their hitboxes, and if mob cramming kicks in, that problem is just going to become worse. But otherwise, I'm pretty okay with how the farm looks. The only issue with the design is, situation normal, cobwebs. They spawn when Weber infernals are hit by the tablets, and then the tablets keep trying and failing to break them, rather than hit the mobs. My solution to this is just to fill the bottom of the pit with water, which works way better than it has any right to. As a side effect, the water tricks the tablets into thinking that they're breaking a block, and this causes them to constantly spam their sword attacks at the fastest possible rate, which really goes a long way to improving their usually pretty lackluster response time. With that change, some relocators to suck the mobs into the water, and a couple more princesses to overclock the system a little bit more, I have a solid loot bag farm that can run as long as it needs to. Like, I don't know, a solid 20 hours or so. Cleaning the place up, I noticed something odd. My water source blocks are missing right next to the dynamism tablets. The swords all have about the same level of durability loss, so I don't think it was cobwebs glitching and replacing the water block. I think somehow the dynamism tablets broke the water block with a sword, it flowed back in, and then they kept breaking flowing water overnight. I simply can't think of any other possible conclusions to draw here. I also end up with way more loot bags than I was expecting. This should totally be enough to get me a pearl, right? There's only one way to find out, so I get to cracking loot bags. Well, that's lame. I got that pearl after like 8 stacks of loot bags. I have an entire backpack of these things. Now what am I gonna do with them? Talk about a massive letdown. I guess I just kind of open them up anyway. I mean, it isn't like I don't have a use for more pearls, so it's not gonna hurt. I made myself a little drop pool to keep from having to chase my junk all over the place and get to work. Seriously, 8 stacks. People are gonna be like, oh no, Goose, you said it was so rare. And I will be like, yes, it is rare. And then they'll be like, you're just gassing us up because you want us to think it's rare. And then I will be like, yes, I want you to think they're rare because they are rare, because the math literally says so. And then I will be like, oh, wait, hey, I just got another. And then everyone is going to stare judgmentally at me. Ugh. So yeah, it was just the 2. I see no reason to not leave the farm running forever, though, so I make sure to fix up the swords and turn it back on. And then if memory serves, I immediately turned it off like half an hour later, so whatever. So what do these pearls actually do for us right now? Well, not a whole lot. That's going to change, though, because scanning the pearl unlocks a research project related to it, and completing that research project unlocks a whole bunch of other fun new things. Like research, which I need to do now. Did I say fun new things? I actually meant... I do not feel like doing any more research, which is a shame, because one of the necessary steps to finishing this little experiment successfully is, like, doing all of the research. Like, literally 100% of it. This just means I need a machine to do it for me, which requires some stuff. Better make that 2 kinds of stuff, because they're small. Which needs some more stuff. Which means, wow, amazing, all of a sudden I have a machine that can do research for me. The only catch is that it needs a node in the center, which, well, I have one node, but it isn't a very good one, so let's see how long that lasts. And it does work, sort of. The machine really does not make the node very happy, but I can get more. It's fine, how much research can possibly be left anyway? So no, it's fine. It turns out that I'm pretty close to being done with my uranium project, so I can distract myself from my inclement warp-induced insanity with an alternative but no less severe bee-induced insanity. It's a bit like accidentally hitting your thumb with a hammer and deciding the best way to distract yourself from the pain is to repeatedly stub your toe on a cactus covered in hot sauce. Nodes don't like being eaten alive and turned into research. My first theory is that if I get enough nodes together in one place and let them engage in a behavior called node bullying, I should maybe possibly be able to feed enough nodes into a big node that the big node will become so big that it doesn't get significantly damaged by any single research project. Naturally, the way that I decide to test this theory is to get eaten by a tree. I ended up spending a great deal of time trying to get silverwood nodes to grow from my saplings. It does technically work, but it takes forever. And also, yeah, this is where I turned off the loot bag farm, because while in principle it might be worth it to keep the thing running, the constant sounds of mobs exploding... Honestly, the constant sounds of explosions being frankly terrifying, and me wanting them to stop, really just describes most of the things I've made up to this point, so I'm not certain why this is so problematic, but whatever. Even without my research machine working, I am apparently insane enough to spawn these dingbats as well. Which are not to be confused with fire bats, by the way, which I have been spawning for several days now. Also, it turns out that I do, in fact, care more about nodes than I thought, because none of the things are strong enough to process even a single research project on their own. My solution to this is to just make a better one, because it turns out that I can do that now. And since I'm actually going to need to do this a second time, I make the raw materials for 2 and just neglect to finish the first. The process does have the slightly inconvenient problem of requiring more essentia than any sane individual would ever feel the need to acquire. Thankfully, I suffer from none of those theoretical sanity-related restrictions, and as such I consider it a fairly trivial manner to cram over 1,000 essentia into a single item. 4 digits? That's some rookie numbers right there. I have more than that sitting right behind me. Other fun things I learned from this. Did you know that you could stick your doppelganger in a soul vial? I didn't know until I tried. I have no idea what I'm going to do with it, but I suppose if I ever get some spawners, maybe I could make the single dumbest mob farm in the world. After some more bee breeding than I care to pay attention to, my first test node is done. Let's plug it in and give it a spin. Putting all that on hold, I have another fun progress report to give. I have alveary blocks now. Unfortunately, I am a few short of what I need to make 3 full alvearies, so I could, like a normal person, just make these extra blocks and call it a day. But unfortunately, caveman brain kicked in at this time and said unga bunga and decided it should instead direct me to create vibrant alloy, to make a vibrant crystal, to make an enchanter, to make enchanted books, to craft loot bags that might only possibly get me the alveary blocks I need. Side question, how many levels are in 3,300 buckets of experience? Let's find out. Turns out about 240-ish. You didn't need to know that, but now you do. Such gifts are things that I provide free of charge on this channel. And my loot bags do net me some pretty good stuff. I got some more combs, some more hives, the block, not the medical condition, though bee breeding does make my skin crawl at this point, so it's kind of a close run thing. And I do get enough alveary parts to get everything working for 3 setups, so that was the important part. Getting the bits I need to customize the alvearies is going to take a while, so I'm going to put that on the back burner and we'll just never talk about it again. Actually, you know what? I will talk about it. In order to get bees producing enough usable material at a speed greater than your average pre-caffeine HR worker, I want to use alveary stimulators to increase their output. This means I need stimulators, gearboxes to power the stimulators, circuits to configure the stimulators, and a source of power to power the gearboxes to power the stimulators. The first 3 need a bunch of random junk, but the most relevant is HV motors, which I'm out of, and circuits of various tiers, which I'm also running out of. But I'm in the process of resupplying those, so that shouldn't be too much of a problem. The last one, power, is something that I want to launder through an Ender IO capacitor, because apparently the power conversion systems don't mix well and waste electricity or something. This would require cadmium to make the capacitor bank, which requires me to process rare earth from my rare earth combs into dusts, dehydrate the dusts, extract the cadmium, make the battery, and yeah. No, I don't actually give a flying duck about power consumption, because I will just route it through an LV combustion engine and call it good. The rest of the problem still applies, though. Regardless of the implementation, I now have enough stuff to make 3 proper apiaries. What am I going to do with them, you ask? Redstone bees. The largest bee produce demand I have right now is honey and wax, and I generally prefer to use saffron or something for those, which means I'm a few species off from being ready to scale alveary production anyway. Redstone bees, in the meantime, will give me stuff to make stuff to make stuff to make stuff to make me not crazy, which will become very important once I finally start using my research machine and cranking out the Thaumcraft. I also finally get around to slapping on the fastest production trait, so they should produce a little bit more reliably as well. Uranium bees are a couple species away still, since I had a slowdown with one of my princesses needing to be acclimatized, but I have all the uranium I need to use once I breed them, so that bottleneck is working itself out as well. It's time for something completely different. Observant individuals will have noticed that I am basically drowning in drones at the moment. This is because the shortest life and highest drone productivity traits, while excellent for crossbreeding bees, are kind of terrible when it comes to actually using them, and this dichotomy has resulted in multiple barrels of obsolete drones just sort of chilling out in various interesting locations. Time to put those to good use. Botania has been accessible to me for quite some time now, and it's just that until recently there wasn't any real demand for any of the services it could offer. This has changed with the existence of the aptly named Begonia, Hyacinth, and Hibiscus. The Begonia eats drones and produces mana. The Hyacinth eats mana and occasionally produces princesses, or drones of the usual default species, and the Hibiscus eats a lot of mana and ignoble princesses and turns them into pristine princesses. With these powers combined, I can now technically turn an unfathomably large amount of drones into usable princesses, and hopefully a couple new species of bee, to ever expand my bee production limits. Which is good, because I'm running out of coins with which to purchase hives at this point, and some hives are straight up unpurchasable for me. Sadly, my progression in this mod is quickly stalled out by my general lack of flowers, which means I need to put some bees to work in my open, flat, grassy areas for a bit. It is at this point that I realize the node isn't being drained by the machine so much as it is being eaten alive. The research entry actually says this, but I didn't process just exactly how aggressive this process is. Regardless, that discovery kind of lowers my respect for the machine a little bit, because while it's still good in principle, nodes are kind of hard to source in bulk, even in regular Gregtech New Horizons. So unless you have bee species that I can't get the hives for at the moment to make nodes bigger, I don't really see how this would be useful for bulk research. Either way, it was cheap, I'll try and use it. Unfortunately for me, one begonia is simply not enough to consume all of my drones in a timely manner. It is time to engage in the favorite pastime of all Botania players, spamming out more flowers. My world state is such that I consider solutions that are only stupid, laggy, and inefficient to be a goal to strive towards, because that existence implies that I have a solution at all. Great deal of nonsense later, and I'm the proud owner of a Hyacinth. This is the one that makes drones and ignoble princesses, rarely, wind-fed mana. My theory is that I can use this to get a bee species that would otherwise be unobtainable, so I slap that down and start watching it. And yes, in no time at all, in fact, literally the only reason I care about Botania right now is sitting in a chest because of this flower. This infernal bee species is the last base species I need to get a branch of bees that are able to manipulate nodes. In particular, I want the bee that will add aspects to a node, because in doing so, that will let me crank out infinite research from my machine without burning through an absurd quantity of the things. After another hour and more nonsense than I care to summarize, I'm able to crossbreed and isolate uranium bees. Unlike all the other species I've used thus far, uranium bees require special conditions that aren't satisfied by my current biome in order to produce the stuff I want from them. These special conditions can, conveniently, be satisfied by installing 3 alveary fans on the side of their alveary. Since I'm already providing power to the stimulators, these don't require any additional work in order to use, and make this a shockingly painless upgrade process. And shortly after that, I'm finished with empowered bees. I highly doubt that my research machine is going to be able to break up a node being constantly resupplied by 8 of these suckers, so come on, research machine. Take your best shot. In fact, let's take the time to admire all the research that I don't have to manually do anymore because of these bees. Instead, all of the time spent doing that research will be spent embracing my new life as a Savonnier in the pursuit of maintaining my mental stability in the face of a very, very large amount of warp. They say that cleanliness is next to godliness. I'm not quite sure what that is going to make my brain by the time I'm done with this little project, but, well, this whole Modpack is just one giant power fantasy, isn't it? The soap production process requires a truly astonishing amount of essentia, particularly Sano and Ordo. In my first 6 stacks of soap alone, I need almost a barrel of fertilizer, and that stuff takes a little while to produce. Rather than automating a system and letting it run in the background while I do other things, I decide it's time for me to unleash the true power of my mob farm on the problem, and spend a solid 20 minutes creating and attaching an upgraded XP bucket autocrafting system to my Frankenstein creation. Until recently, this thing has been set up to prioritize the production of mob drops over experience, because I've been farming Endermen for mob drops. For many mobs, Endermen included, the replacement rate of the drops is less than 1, so it has to run with the looting spike to ensure that it's sustaining itself in the long term. But for short bursts of 20 to 30 minutes or so, it should be fine to switch over to a XP production mode. My production material of choice is gypsum. In addition to Sano, it has Aqua, Air, Ignis, and Perdido Essentia, which means I can double dip and also produce a fair bit of Salus Mundus as a byproduct of the soap making process. The only problem that I've discovered with the system is that it produces a lot of incorrect recipes. I solve this problem in my usual goose fashion, by throwing some ugly redstone at it until it partially goes away, and then ignoring the problem, and paying no mind to the half a dozen other, no doubt significantly better options available to me at this point. It does take a little bit of fiddling to get the timing right, and it won't really work that well if I'm not capping out on my XP production, but I also don't care, so there is that. This thing is a blight on the face of good engineering, and I love it. I also have no idea why it is raining the severed heads of my enemies, but I like the look, because it really adds a lot to the ambiance. After a solid day of letting my bees cook, or in one case, irradiate, I come back to a hefty barrel of combs, enough for almost 14 stacks of soap. Amazingly, all the soap that I can make from these combs is still not enough to get through my researched backlog, so I end up going AFK for another day to restock my combs again. Side note, my crucible was nasty after doing this. It also ends up being the case that this still is not enough soap, so I let my bees cook for another day, turn that into soap, and finally that is enough. For now. Some of you may be wondering just exactly how much soap I'm going to need to pull this off. If I had to guess, I'd say that I'm somewhere around 80 to 90% of the way through all of my research at this point, but it's kind of a little tricky to estimate, so I'm just gonna give it a best shot. Doing all of the research in this pack gives me 722 permanent warp and 560 normal warp. Because the highest efficiency usage of Alistair's soap grants me a 40% chance of converting 1 permanent warp into 2 normal warp, this means that I'm going to need 1,805 Alistair soap, on average, and 2,004 of the unpronounceable red soap to scrub all of this warp away, which is a project that will cost me somewhere in the neighborhood of 17,149 soapstone dust, 9,525 zombie brains or paper, 53,334 iron rounds or beeswax, 121,888 cotton seeds, 16,745 enderman heads, approximately 35,000 bones, not counting what I need for the cotton, approximately 35,000 rotten flesh, again, approximate because I don't actually care, and a whopping 156,804 gypsum, a demand that on its own consumes more essence than what I used to make my Mega EBF by a factor of 5. So why, in the name of all that is good and holy, did I feel the need to research every possible research project in my book? Science. Vanilla Thaumcraft has a mechanic where you can craft 9 knowledge shards together into a piece of what is called unknown research. Using this item will generate a research note for a research project randomly selected from the pool of all non-completed eligible research products. I'm fairly certain that the research unlocked or gated behind special actions or warp levels, such as the Eldritch Revelations, Epiphanies, and the Reading of the Crimson Rites, are exempt from this mechanic, but I don't actually know that, and I also don't know what, if any, limitations there are with this normally, because it's a dog-tier mechanic that nobody ever bothers to use, so I want to test it out. What I do know is that this mechanic does not give beans about normal prerequisites, and will quite happily unlock things that you cannot see in your Thaumnomicon, and I want all of those to be done as well. Loot bags can occasionally drop knowledge fragments, so I open all my spare loot bags to try and collect as many of those as I can. And after cleaning up a mess that would have turned Mark Rober green with envy, I get started with the progression breaking. My first research project is whatever the heck a book of knowledge is. Sure. I want to learn how to make that, please. Since I didn't unlock any child researches from finishing that, I create another blank research and try again. This one gives me fancy mushroom soup, which I guess might be relevant if I actually had mushrooms in the first place. My next note gives me some random Apocrypha thing. This trend of nonsense research will continue for a bit, so I'm just going to skip ahead here. I know that I'm done, because whenever I try and use the unknown research, it breaks itself back down into shards. And it sadly does not look like unknown researches will let me skip that progression blocker, so that's unfortunate, but it's still fine, because I actually already have what I need. Hidden at the end of a research tree, in a lesser-known Thaumcraft mod called Thaumic Horizons, is a gem of a research project called New Horizons, which definitely has not and does not continue to give me brain spaghetti every time I try and remember the research named New Horizons in the Thaumic Horizons mod of the Thaumcraft mod, which is part of the Modpack Gregtech New Horizons. Recall what I mentioned earlier about the best way to locate cheese in this mod pack. Bad documentation, not part of a traditional progression path, and expensive or unrewarding. This little blurb has all three. In addition to this research unlocking the ability for you to bend the Vist crafting rebalance over your knee and spank it soundly, it also has the oh-so-casual and understated mechanic of oops, suddenly mistcraft, in that it unlocks the ability for you to create new universes. Wow, golly gee, I can't imagine how that might become relevant. Unlike Mistcraft, these dimensions are basically just little bubbles of space that generate themselves in a void world, so you don't do the Mistcraft thing where you run out of dimension IDs and brick your game. Though maybe that's just a me problem. Since I'm the one creating them, using them is fair game for the rules of this run. This custom universe mechanic is super complicated and lets you customize your new universe bubble by manipulating the quantity and ratio of aspects in the node that you use to do the process. Naturally, how aspects influence this world you create is entirely undocumented, which means that I get to go pull the code and do the documentation myself. So, let's talk tech while I do some experimenting in the background. First things first. Pocket dimensions take the form of a sphere and are determined by the size of the node. Take the total aspect count of your node, multiply it by 0.75. That is the radius of your dimension sphere, with a floor of 32 blocks and a ceiling of 127 blocks to prevent what should hopefully be the obvious problem. They can also give you passive potion effects if certain aspects are present, but I don't give a toss about this, and I've never gotten it to work right, so whatever. These dimensions can have rings on the outside of the bubble, made from various kinds of materials if certain aspects are present. The only material I care about here is Eldritch Stone, which is added by the aspect of the same name, but adding Eldritch, i.e. Alienus Essentia, Essence, whatever you want to call it, has other effects that are less desirable, so I'm going to avoid doing that with mine. Noise is something that determines how hilly and wonky looking the land in the dimension generates, with a default value of some. I don't care about it, but you might. Life, however, is something that I do care about, because I want a lot of it. This controls plant and animal spawn rates, and is directly influenced by a lot of aspects, for better or worse. Though some aspects have such a significantly larger effect than others that it doesn't really matter, keep in mind for some of these effects, having any of an aspect present is enough to trigger it, but for most of them, it's the ratio of aspects that actually matter. Case in point, if I wanted to max out the life rating of a dimension, 2/3 of the dimension's node would have to be Victus, the aspect of life, or Sano, the aspect of healing, which is a lot of node real estate to dedicate to this largely pointless feature. Draw layers is a delicious death ball of code that controls what your world is made of and how it looks. Essentially, it starts at the middle of your dimension sphere and then runs through a list of various aspects. If your node has those aspects, it fills a percentage of the dimension below that middle point with a block corresponding to that aspect. For example, if I have a node that's 30% Gelum, 30% Aqua, 30% Panus, and 10% Corpus with 133 aspects in total, I would end up with a dimension that is roughly 100 blocks on the radius, with a floor made roughly of 30% ice, 30% water, which would then freeze because of Gelum's other effects, 30% wool, and 10% meat. That may or may not also be mixed up quite a lot depending on the noise value. This gets a little more complicated with the Earth aspect Terra, since that checks the biome and the ratio of Ordo to Perdido essence. Depending on the biome of the dimension, you will either get sand, dirt, grass, or if your biome doesn't recommend one of those options, stone or cobblestone, depending on the ratio of Ordo and Perdido. Ignis will give you netherrack, Vidium gives you taint, Tudamen gives you obsidian, and all of this is randomized around by that noise level. Also, if you select nothing, you get dust, which is basically just black, useless sand that does not fall. Draw layers also is where plant spawning and animal spawning comes into play. Depending on the level of life in your world and whether or not certain aspects are present, water can spawn squids, dirt blocks can spawn a bunch of different plants, saplings, and passive mobs, taint blocks can spawn brains and taint mobs, blah 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 blah. Interestingly, as long as your life level is above 10, you can request these features to show up by adding little bits of the relevant aspect like Herba or Bestia, rather than by brute forcing it with a bunch of Victus or something. Underground features are controlled by a bunch of stuff, and the presence and absence of certain aspect can mostly do fancy things called dressings, which are different kind of decorative blocks and ores and stuff. A lot of it doesn't seem to be super consistent or implemented properly yet. And finally, biomes. The rules for biome selection are, in order, if your node has any taint, you get a tainted biome. And then, If your node has any Alianus, you get an Eerie biome. Then, if you have any Aurum or Precanto, you get a magical forest biome. And finally, if you have none of those aspects, your biome is determined by the moisture and humidity ratios created by a balance of a bunch of other aspects. The final arrangement I end up deciding on is an even mix of Aurum, Bestia, Sano, and Terra, mostly because they're aspects that don't make huge, sweeping changes to things that might mess up the world. Aurum enables certain magical plants to spawn and forces the biome to be a magical forest. Bestia encourages animals to spawn, Sano bumps my life ratio up to let the first two aspects work, and Terra should make sure everything has a nice dirt foundation on, and opens me up to having certain kinds of ores spawn in. I will also make sure that the node has at least 48 of each, because bigger is better and I want a max size dimension. Unfortunately for you, though, I will have to leave the creation and exploration of this new universe as something to do in the next episode. Thank you for your time. Unlike nodes, which can make do with Essentia infusion, this channel grows larger by infusions of engagement metrics. Options for refilling that metric are located down below for those of you who are interested, and, as always, I hope you enjoyed.